I'm Debbie Reynolds, 78, a woman, and last Saturday, my husband of 10 years told me to know my place after his late wife's mother slapped me across the face. It wasn't the sting on my cheek that I remember most clearly. It was the Arctic coldness that followed, a profound internal winter that froze a decade of memories into brittle, transparent lies. In that one stark moment, I saw everything for what it was and what it had always been. The man I had loved, the family I had tried so desperately to nurture, they were all strangers. And I, Beatrice Thorne, was a guest in my own home, a ghost at my own table. My story doesn't begin with Robert Thorne, though he is its painful conclusion. It begins with William. William Pendleton was my husband for 42 years, and he was the architect of my world. He was a quiet man, a structural engineer who saw life in terms of foundations and support beams. He believed in building things that would last, and that included our love, our home, and my security. We never had children of our own, a quiet sorrow we bore together, but we filled our lives with friends, with travel, and with a deep, abiding companionship that I believed was a once-in-a-lifetime gift. When William passed from a sudden heart attack, the foundations of my world crumbled. The silence in the house we had built together was a physical presence, a heavy cloak of grief. I was 67 years old and had never known a day of adult life without him. For a year, I simply existed, tending to the garden he had loved, going through the motions. My friend Arthur Pendleton, William's younger brother and our lawyer, made sure the estate was settled cleanly. William, ever the planner, had left me more than secure. He had left me a fortress of financial independence, a legacy I never truly grasped the scale of until much later. To me, it was just our money, a resource to be tended to, not a weapon to be wielded. It was at a charity luncheon that I met Robert Thorne. He was everything William was not, gregarious, charming, with a head of silver hair and a smile that seemed to reach his sea-blue eyes. He was a widower himself, his wife Elizabeth having passed away some years prior. He spoke of her with a reverence that I found touching. He spoke of his son David and his granddaughter Chloe with a warmth that seemed to promise a ready-made family, a balm for my lonely heart. He pursued me with a gentle persistence that slowly chipped away at the walls I had built around myself. He brought me flowers from the market. He took me to matinee shows. He made me laugh again, a sound I thought had died with William. When he proposed a year later on a bench overlooking the ocean, I hesitated. Was I betraying William's memory? Beatrice, Robert said, taking my hands in his. Love isn't a finite resource. It doesn't run out, it just changes shape. William gave you a wonderful life. Let me give you a wonderful rest of your life. And I, a woman starved for companionship, believed him. We were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Arthur was my witness, his expression carefully neutral. I sold the smaller house William and I had shared and moved into Robert's larger, more stately home, or rather, I moved into the house that had belonged to his family. To show my commitment, and because it was frankly more beautiful and spacious, I offered to pay off the substantial mortgage and fund a complete renovation. It was my wedding gift to us. The house was legally put into a trust in my name, a detail Arthur insisted upon for tax purposes, but in my heart I made it our home. Robert was overjoyed, and I felt for the first time in years a sense of purpose. I was building again. The family came with the house. His son David was a man in his early 40s then, with his father's height but none of his charm. He was quiet, almost sullen, and worked in a vaguely defined finance job that never seemed to quite cover the expenses of his daughter Chloe's private school. I tried to connect with him, asking about his work, his hobbies. He would offer one-word answers, his eyes always slightly averted, as if he were speaking to a space just over my shoulder. His daughter, Chloe, was a child of 9 when I first met her. She was a pretty girl with her grandfather's blue eyes and a perpetually sour expression. I baked her cookies, I bought her books, I attended her school plays. She accepted these offerings with the silent indifference of a tiny, unimpressed queen. As she grew into a teenager, her indifference sharpened into a quiet, simmering disdain. Then there was the extended family, the specter of the sainted first wife, Elizabeth. Her family, the Vances, remained deeply enmeshed with the Thorns. Her mother, Eleanor, a woman with a spine of iron and eyes like chips of flint, was the matriarch. From our first meeting, she appraised me not as a person, but as a replacement, and she found me wanting. The othering, as I came to call it in my own mind, was never overt. It was 1,000 tiny paper cuts. At our first Christmas together, the entire evening was spent regaling stories of Elizabeth. Oh, Elizabeth used to make the most divine standing rib roast, Alina would announce just as I brought my carefully prepared turkey to the table. Robert would just pat my hand and say, "It's lovely, dear," without ever defending my contribution. I felt like a footnote in my own celebration. Another time, when Chloe was about 15, she was showing a school friend around the house. I was in the library arranging some books. "And this was my real grandmother's favorite room," she said, her voice carrying clearly. She had impeccable taste. The implication hung in the air that I did not. The most telling incident before the end came on Robert's 78th birthday. David gave a toast. "To Dad," he said, raising his glass, "and to Mom, I know she's watching over us. Things were so much simpler when she was here, but we're all so grateful you have Beatrice to look after you now." He said it with a thin smile, but the message was clear. I was not family, I was the help. I looked at Robert, expecting him to correct his son to include me as his wife. He just smiled, basking in the attention, and said, "Thank you, son, that means the world." That night I felt a familiar chill, a flicker of the profound loneliness I thought I had left behind, but I pushed it down. I had made my choice. I would be a good wife. I would make this work. I watered the roots of this family with my kindness, my patience, and though it felt vulgar to think of it, my money. I paid for Chloe's tuition at a prestigious East Coast university. I funded David's investment opportunities that never seemed to pan out. I paid for the vacations, the cars, the country club membership. I did it willingly, believing it was the price of admission, the dues for belonging to a family. I didn't realize I was only paying to be tolerated. The last Saturday of my old life was a perfect June day. The sky was a flawless painted blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the great oak tree that stood sentinel over the backyard. This garden was my sanctuary. When I first moved in, it was a neglected space of patchy grass and overgrown shrubs. Over 10 years, with William's inheritance funding the finest saplings and my own hands tending the soil, I had cultivated it into a tapestry of color and life. The rose bushes, my pride and joy, were heavy with blossoms, their perfume sweetening the air. I was hosting my annual garden party. This was my event. It was not for Robert's business associates or the Vance clan. It was for my friends, women I had known for 30 or 40 years, women who had held my hand at William's funeral, women who knew the real Beatrice. Margaret, with her shock of white hair and booming laugh, Helen, quiet and observant, and a dozen others. They were my true north, a link to a life where I was not an adjective, not a step anything, but simply myself. Robert was in his element, of course, playing the gracious lord of the manor. He wore a crisp linen shirt and moved among my friends with an easy charm that I had once found so captivating. Now, watching him, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing a character in a play. David hovered near the bar, nursing a drink, while Chloe, home for the summer from college, sat slumped in a wicker chair, scrolling endlessly through her phone, the very picture of teenage boredom and contempt. And then there was Alina Vance. She had arrived uninvited, as she often did, a self-appointed inspector general, ensuring that the memory of her sainted daughter was not being desecrated by my hydrangeas. She sat in the shadiest spot on the patio, a thundercloud in a floral dress, accepting a glass of iced tea as if it were a disappointing legal settlement. For the first hour, things were pleasant enough. My friends chatted and laughed, complimenting the food, the flowers, the perfect weather. I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps this blended world could work. The first crack in the facade appeared when Chloe, dispatched by her grandfather to fetch a plate of canapes, returned empty-handed. "They're out of the little salmon things," she announced to no one in particular, her voice dripping with disdain. "Probably for the best. They tasted frozen." I felt a flush of heat on my neck, but I smiled graciously. "There are plenty of others, dear. Help yourself." She rolled her eyes and returned to her chair. A short while later, Margaret, my dearest friend, came to stand beside me as we looked out over the rose garden. "Beatrice, this is just breathtaking," she said, her voice full of genuine admiration. "William would have been so proud of what you've done here. You have such a gift." Her words were a balm, a reminder of who I was. I smiled, a real smile this time. Thank you, Maggie. He taught me everything I know about roses." It was then that Chloe's voice, sharp and loud, cut through the gentle hum of conversation. Well, it's easy to grow a nice garden when you're living off a dead man's money. A handful of conversations sputtered and died. The air grew thick with a sudden, shocked silence. I turned slowly. Chloe was still looking at her phone, but a smug, triumphant smirk played on her lips. She hadn't just spoken, she had detonated a bomb, and it was aimed directly at my heart. She continued, twisting the knife. My real grandma Elizabeth built this family with her bare hands, not some fat inheritance. The insult was breathtakingly cruel, a calculated strike against my life with William, my current role, my very character. It cheapened my grief, my love, my generosity, and recast me as a gold-digging usurper. I looked around. My friends were staring, their faces a mixture of horror and pity. Robert was frozen mid-laugh with one of my friends, a plastic smile still on his face as he failed to process what had just happened. David looked down into his drink, his jaw tight. And Alina Vance, from her throne of shade, was watching me, her eyes glinting with a cold, undisguised satisfaction. She had waited 10 years for this moment. The blood drained from my face, and for a second the beautiful garden blurred, the vibrant colors running together like watercolors in the rain. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me waiting. They were waiting for me to cry, to scream, to make a scene, but something inside me, a core of strength I had long forgotten, held firm. I would not give them the satisfaction, not in front of my friends, not in my garden. For a long moment, I did nothing. I simply stood there, absorbing the shockwave, letting the silence stretch until it was taut and humming with tension. Then I turned back to Margaret, gave her hand a slight squeeze, and offered a small, brittle smile. "Will you excuse me for a moment, Maggie?" I walked with a calm I did not feel across the lawn, my steps measured and deliberate. I did not go to Chloe, not yet. I went to the drink table, poured myself a glass of water, and took a slow sip. My hands were perfectly steady. I was a ship in a storm, and while the rigging was straining and the waves were crashing over the deck, the keel, buried deep, was holding. I would not founder. I made my way through the party, murmuring pleasantries, assuring my concerned friends with a look that I was fine, that it was a small thing, a misunderstanding. I would not allow Chloe's venom to poison this day, to ruin this time with the people I truly cherished. But as the afternoon wore on and my friends began to depart with lingering, worried glances, I knew it could not be ignored. This was a wound that required more than a polite bandage. When only a handful of guests remained, I saw Chloe heading toward the house. This was the moment. I intercepted her near the French doors that led to the living room, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Chloe," I said, my voice low and even. "A word, please, in private." She tried to pull away, but I held firm. "In the library," I insisted. She followed me with theatrical slowness, slumping into one of the leather armchairs opposite the grand fireplace, a monument to a life and a family that had existed long before me. I remained standing. "Chloe," I began, choosing my words with care. "What you said in the garden was designed to be as hurtful as possible. It was cruel, it was untrue, and it was deeply disrespectful not just to me but to the memory of a good man. It was unacceptable." She stared at me, her blue eyes hard and defiant. "It was the truth. You're not my grandmother, you're just the woman my grandpa married." "I have never tried to replace your grandmother," I said, my voice still quiet. "I have only ever tried to be a friend to you and a part of this family." "Some friend," a man's voice interrupted. It was David, her father. He had been lurking in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Interrogating her. "I am speaking to her about her behavior, David," I replied, turning to face him. "Something a parent ought to do." "Don't you talk to me about parenting," he sneered, stepping into the room. "You have no idea." Before I could respond, another figure filled the doorway. It was Alina Vance, her face a mask of cold fury. "I heard what was happening. How dare you," she hissed, advancing on me. "How dare you corner this child and bully her?" "I was not bullying her, Alina," I said, standing my ground. "I was." I never finished the sentence. Her hand flew up and cracked across my cheek. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet room. My head snapped to the side and a sharp, stinging pain erupted on my skin. I brought a trembling hand to my face, not from the pain, but from the sheer, unadulterated shock. A 75-year-old woman had just slapped me, in my own home. Don't you dare say anything to her," Aliner's voice was low and shaking with rage. Or next time it won't be just a slap. I stared at her speechless. I looked past her to David, her son-in-law, my stepson. His face was impassive, his eyes cold. If you want to discipline someone, he said with a shrug, have your own child. The cruelty of his words, a direct strike at the great sorrow of my first marriage, was more stunning than the slap. From the chair, Chloe smirked. Finally, she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Someone who gets it. The room seemed to fill with their allies. Aliner's husband, Richard, a man who rarely spoke, appeared behind his wife. Some people just don't understand family dynamics, he mumbled, looking at me with distaste. I looked desperately around the room for an ally, for a lifeline. My eyes fell on my husband. Robert had finally entered the room, drawn by the commotion. He had seen it. He had seen his late wife's mother strike his current wife. I looked at him, my expression pleading, begging him to restore sanity, to defend me, to be the man I had married. He looked from my face to Aliner S., to his son S., to his granddaughter S. I saw a flicker of conflict in his eyes, a brief struggle, and then I saw him make a choice. He squared his shoulders and his expression hardened, erasing any trace of the charming man I thought I knew. Beatrice, that's enough, he said, his voice quiet but laced with an unmistakable edge of command. He took a step toward me, creating a physical line between me and them. He had chosen his side. This has gone too far. She is my blood. This is my family. He paused, letting the words sink in, a final, brutal verdict. You need to learn your place. Learn my place. The sting on my cheek faded, replaced by an icy calm. The frantic beating of my heart slowed. In the space of 30 seconds, I had been assaulted, insulted, and disowned by the man who had promised to give me a wonderful rest of my life. I saw them all clearly then, a united front of entitlement and resentment, their faces smug in their victory. I looked at Robert, the stranger wearing my husband's face. I looked at Chloe, preening in her chair. I looked at Aliner, righteous and unrepentant. I did not cry, I did not rage, I simply smiled. It was a tiny smile, a private acknowledgement of a truth so profound and terrible it was almost funny. I had been a fool. I see, I said, my voice a mere whisper, and I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to their triumph. I didn't flee. I walked back through the now empty living room, out the French doors, and into my garden. The last of the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. The air was still sweet with the scent of roses. I busied myself with small, meaningless tasks, plucking a dead head from a bush, straightening a tilted sprinkler, folding the last few napkins left on a table. My movements were slow and automatic, my mind a blank, white space. I was in shock, my emotional systems shut down to prevent a catastrophic overload. My friends were all gone, the caterers had packed up their things and left, the house was quiet, too quiet. Robert found me by the koi pond. "B, are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, as if approaching a spooked animal. He tried to put his arm around my shoulders. I flinched away, a purely instinctual reaction, as if from a hot stove. "Don't touch me," I said. The words were flat, devoid of anger or any emotion at all. He sighed, a sound of paternal frustration. "Look, I know you're upset. Alina shouldn't have, well, things got heated. You know how families are, B. You were a bit hard on the girl. Chloe is sensitive." I turned to look at him then. I studied his face, the handsome, familiar features that had suddenly become a grotesque mask. Sensitive, the girl who had publicly announced I was a gold digger living off a dead man's fortune, hard on her. The woman who had been physically assaulted for daring to ask for an ounce of respect. The disconnect between his reality and mine was a chasm too wide to bridge. He didn't see what had happened. He couldn't, or worse, he wouldn't. "I'm going to bed," I said, not waiting for a response. I walked up the grand, curving staircase, my hand trailing on the polished wood of the banister. I did not turn into the master suite that Robert and I had shared for 10 years. I continued down the hall to the guest room at the far end. It was a lovely room, decorated in pale blues and creams with a view of the front lawn. It was also the room I had stayed in for a week before our wedding, full of hope and nervous excitement. Now it felt like a prison cell. I closed the door and slid the bolt across. The sound echoed the finality I felt in my soul. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped in my lap, and I waited. I thought the tears would come, a great heaving storm of grief and humiliation, but they didn't. There was only the cold and the silence and the voice of my husband echoing in my head. Learn your place. My place, for 10 years, I thought my place was by his side. I thought it was in the heart of this family I had so carefully tended. I thought it was in the garden I had brought back to life, in the kitchen where I cooked holiday meals, in the living room where we'd entertained. I thought my place was as a wife, a stepmother, a step-grandmother. What a fool I had been. My place in their eyes was the bank. I was the provider of a comfortable lifestyle they felt entitled to. I was the placeholder, the convenient, wealthy widow who could fill the void Elizabeth had left, not in their hearts, but in their finances. My love, my care, my endless efforts, they were not just unappreciated, they were unseen, irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was blood, and my blood was not their blood. The hours of the night ticked by. I didn't sleep. I replayed every memory from the last decade, but this time I saw them through the clarifying lens of Robert's betrayal. The passive-aggressive comments, the backhanded compliments, the stories of St. Elizabeth, they weren't careless slights. They were markers on a map, deliberately placed to remind me of the borders of my belonging. I was allowed in the country, but I would never be a citizen. I felt the full weight of my 78 years. The thought of starting over was not just daunting, it was terrifying. The world I had so carefully reconstructed after William's death had been a house of cards, and my own husband had been the one to pull the final, load-bearing card from the bottom. I was alone, more alone than I had been in the depths of my widowhood, because that was a loneliness of absence. This was a loneliness of presence, the agony of being surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle or a resource. Grief did come eventually in the cold, gray hour before dawn. It was a silent, internal weeping, a mourning not for the family I had lost, but for the family I now knew I had never had at all. I mourned for my own naivety, for the 10 years I had wasted trying to earn a love that was never on offer. And as the first rays of sun angled through the window, the grief began to recede, leaving something else in its place. It was hard and pure and cold, like a diamond formed under immense pressure. It was resolve. The smile I had given them in the library, they had mistaken it for surrender. It wasn't. It was the moment the general inside me, long dormant, finally surveyed the battlefield, understood the enemy, and began to draw up a plan of attack. The night was for mourning. The morning was for war. Dawn broke, painting the ceiling with pale, watery light. I rose from the bed, my limbs stiff but my mind unnervingly clear. I showered and dressed, not in my usual soft loungewear, but in a tailored pair of slacks and a silk blouse. I put on a pearl necklace William had given me for our 30th anniversary. It felt like armor. I went downstairs. The house was still. Robert had evidently slept in the master bedroom, a mere 50 feet and a universe away. I made a pot of coffee in the kitchen, the familiar ritual grounding me. The smell of the brewing coffee was the same, but the house itself felt different. It was no longer my home. It was a property. A very valuable, very beautiful property that I happened to own. I took my coffee into the library. This was my sanctuary within a sanctuary, the one room I had insisted on keeping exactly as it had been. It was paneled in dark cherry wood and lined floor to ceiling with books. It was William's study, and it still smelled faintly of him, old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. Robert rarely came in here. He called it stuffy. To me, it was the soul of the house. On a shelf tucked behind a collection of Dickens was an old leather-bound address book. It was mine from my life before Robert. My fingers, trembling only slightly, traced the faded gold lettering on the cover. I flipped through the pages, past the names of friends who were long gone, until I found the entry I was looking for, Pendleton Arthur. I picked up the heavy, old-fashioned telephone on the desk and dialed the number. It was just after 7 a.m. on a Sunday, but I knew he would be awake. Arthur was an early riser, a creature of discipline and habit. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert. "Pendleton." "Arthur," I said, "it's Beatrice Thorne." There was a slight pause. "Beatrice, it's good to hear from you. Is everything all right?" His tone was instantly laced with concern. He knew I would not call him at this hour on a whim. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice steady. "Everything is not all right." And then I told him everything. I didn't cry or embellish. I recited the events of the previous day with the cold precision of a police report. Chloe's insult, my attempt to speak with her, Eleanor's slap, David's words. And finally, Robert's betrayal. I repeated his exact phrase, "You need to learn your place." I finished, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't a disconnect. It was the silence of a formidable mind processing information and formulating a response. "Good," Arthur said finally, and his voice was devoid of platitudes. It was hard, like flint striking steel. "The morning is over, now for the war, don't move, I'll be there in an hour." He arrived in 50 minutes. Arthur was 79, a year older than me, but he moved with the energy of a man 20 years younger. He was tall and spare, always dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his white hair immaculately combed. He was the executor of William's will and the fiercest friend I had. He walked into the library, placed his briefcase on the desk, and gave me a long, searching look. "Let me see," he said. I turned my face to the light. The mark from Eleanor's slap had faded to a pale, pinkish blotch, but it was still visible. Arthur's jaw tightened and a dangerous light flared in his eyes. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" or "I'm so sorry." He simply nodded, a confirmation of the facts. "Right," he said, opening his briefcase. "Let's review the fortifications." For the next 2 hours, Arthur laid out the legal and financial reality of my situation. It was a fortress, just as William had intended. We sat at the great mahogany desk, the very desk where William had planned our future, and Arthur, his successor and brother, planned my liberation. The house, as I knew but had forgotten the importance of, was held in the Beatrice Pendleton Trust. I was the sole trustee and beneficiary. Robert's name was not on the deed. It was mine and mine alone. The investment portfolio, a considerable one which generated the income that funded the family's entire lifestyle. The country club, the cars, David's business, seed money, Chloe's $80,000 a year university tuition was also entirely within the trust. Robert's modest pension barely covered his personal tailoring and golf expenses. And then there was the prenuptial agreement. Robert had laughed when I'd insisted on it, patting my hand and calling me a worrywart. "My dear, what's yours is ours," he had said. Arthur had drafted it, and it was ironclad. In the event of a divorce, each party would leave with the assets they had brought into the marriage. Robert had brought a mortgaged house, a modest pension, and a mountain of family baggage. I had brought everything else. As Arthur spoke, laying out the facts with dispassionate clarity, my grief and fear were burned away by a clean, cold anger. This was not just about a slap or a cruel word. This was about a decade of systematic exploitation, cloaked in the guise of affection. They had not just taken my love for granted, they had monetized it. They had viewed my generosity not as a gift, but as their due. My resolve, which had been forged in the lonely hours of the night, now hardened into unbreakable steel. This was not about revenge. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion. This was about justice. It was about restoring balance. It was about honoring the man who had worked his entire life to ensure I would be safe and respected, not fleeced and humiliated. I looked at Arthur, his sharp, intelligent face etched with loyalty. "What do you want to do, Beatrice?" he asked gently. I took a deep breath. "I want to honor my husband's wishes," I said, looking at the portrait of William that hung over the fireplace. "His legacy was meant to protect me, so that is what we will do. File the papers, Arthur, sell the house, liquidate the accounts that are tied to them. Leave them with exactly what the prenuptial agreement entitles them to. Leave them with what they brought to the table." Arthur nodded slowly, a thin, satisfied smile touching his lips. "And what did Robert Thorne bring to the table, Beatrice?" I looked at my lawyer, my friend, the last remaining piece of my true family. "Nothing," I said. "He brought nothing at all." 3 days later, the trap was set. They were 3 days of surreal calm. I continued to sleep in the guest room. Robert attempted to act as if things were returning to normal, a minor domestic squall that had passed. He would greet me in the morning with a cheerful, "Sleep well, dear." I would simply nod and retreat to the library or the garden. He mistook my silence for acquiescence, for a wife sulking who would eventually come around. He had no idea he was living with a ghost in a house that was no longer his. On Wednesday evening, I approached him in the living room where he was reading the paper. Robert, I said, my voice neutral. I think it's time we cleared the air. I've had some time to think, and I realize things were said in the heat of the moment. I would like to speak with everyone, you, David, Chloe, and Alina. I think I owe you all an apology for the misunderstanding. His face lit up with relief. This was what he had been waiting for. The difficult woman had seen reason. Of course, Beatrice, of course, that's a wonderful idea. I'll call them right now. We'll have it tomorrow evening. He was magnanimous in what he perceived as his victory. They arrived the next evening at 7 o'clock sharp. The whole clan, Robert looking pleased and proprietary, David with his usual air of grudging attendance, Chloe unable to completely hide a smirk of triumph, and Alina dressed in severe navy blue, her expression that of a monarch prepared to accept a formal surrender. They gathered in the formal living room, settling into the plush sofas and armchairs that my money had paid for. They were smug. They were victorious. They were waiting for me to beg for forgiveness for the crime of being assaulted and insulted in my own home. Robert poured them all sherry. I declined. At 7:10, I made my entrance. I was not alone. Flanking me was Arthur Pendleton, dressed in a dark gray suit, carrying his leather briefcase. The mood in the room shifted instantly. Robert, who was midway through a jovial anecdote, stopped cold. He recognized Arthur, and a flicker of unease crossed his face. Alina narrowed her eyes, sensing an unexpected change in the script. I did not sit down. I remained standing in the entryway to the room, a position of command. Arthur stood slightly behind me, a silent, formidable guard. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice clear and steady, echoing slightly in the suddenly silent room. "I won't take much of your time." Robert cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim control. "Beatrice, we were just saying, we're all glad you've come to your senses." "Let me stop you right there, Robert," I said, my gaze sweeping over all of them. "There has been a grave misunderstanding, but it is not on my part." I gestured to Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton has some documents for you." Arthur stepped forward and, with the precision of a seasoned dealer, distributed 4 crisp manila folders, one to each of them: Robert, David, Chloe, and Alina. They stared at them as if they were venomous snakes. "Well, what is this?" David demanded, snatching his folder from Arthur's hand. "That," Arthur said, his voice calm and authoritative, "is a copy of the prenuptial agreement signed by Mr. and Mrs. Thorne 10 years ago. I've highlighted the relevant clauses regarding the division of assets upon the dissolution of the marriage." "Dissolution," Robert whispered, his face turning a pasty white. He looked at me, his blue eyes wide with disbelief. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, his voice relentless, "Mr. Thorne is being served with these." He produced a separate, thicker envelope and placed it firmly in Robert's trembling hand. "Divorce papers, filed this morning on the grounds of irreconcilable differences." The room erupted. David shot to his feet, yelling about lawyers and lawsuits. Chloe's jaw dropped, her smug expression melting into one of pure, slack-jawed shock. Alina was, for the first time since I had met her, utterly speechless. "And finally," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, silencing it, "regarding this property," I gestured around the magnificent room, "this house and everything in it is the sole asset of the Beatrice Pendleton Trust. As of this morning, it is officially on the market. An agent will be contacting you tomorrow to arrange viewings. You will have 30 days to vacate the premises." I let the words land, each one a perfectly aimed stone. I looked at Chloe. "Chloe," I said, "I have also instructed the trust to cease all future tuition payments to your university, and David, the line of credit for your business ventures has been closed, effective immediately." The chaos subsided, replaced by a thick, horrified silence. They were finally beginning to understand. Their entire world, their beautiful house, their status, their easy money, their future, it was all built on a foundation they had just dynamited. Robert finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, broken thing. "Beatrice, you can't, after all these years, I'm your husband." I took a step forward, and for the first time I let the cold fury I had been holding in check flash in my eyes. "You told me to learn my place, Robert," I said, my voice low and shaking with a decade of suppressed pain. "And I have spent the last 3 days learning my place. My place is not as a doormat for your entitled family. My place is not as an unloved convenience. My place is in charge of my own life, my own finances, and my own dignity. I looked past him at the rest of them, their faces a gallery of panic and disbelief. You all spoke of blood, blood relations, family dynamics, you were right. My first husband, William Pendleton, the man whose fat inheritance you so casually mocked, left his legacy, his life's work, his blood, sweat, and tears to protect me. And that is what I am finally doing. I am protecting my self and I am honoring him. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. I turned to my friend. Arthur, I said calmly, I believe we are finished here. Together we turned and walked out of the room, leaving the Thorne family sitting in the ruins of the life they thought was theirs. The sound of David's renewed shouting and a woman's, I think it was Chloe's, first sob followed us out, but I didn't look back. I was already walking toward my future. I never saw them again. Arthur, in his magnificent efficiency, handled everything. He was a shield, absorbing their frantic calls, their impotent legal threats, their desperate pleas. He dealt with the real estate agents, the movers, the banks. I was free. The house sold in less than a month for a staggering sum. I instructed Arthur to pack up only two things, the contents of the library and my gardening tools. Everything else, the furniture Robert and I had picked out, the artwork, the expensive china, I had it all donated to a charity for battered women. A final, silent piece of commentary. I did not buy another house. The thought of managing a large property, of being tied down, no longer appealed to me. Instead, I bought a beautiful, light-filled condominium in a modern building overlooking the ocean. It was on the top floor with a wide terrace that wrapped around the living room. It was half the size of the Thorne house and twice as peaceful. The first few weeks were an adjustment. The quiet was absolute. At first, it felt like the crushing silence after William's death. But this was different. It wasn't the silence of absence, but the silence of peace. There were no eggshells to walk on, no passive-aggressive comments to deflect, no underlying tension to navigate. There was only the sound of the waves crashing on the shore below and the cry of the gulls. I reconnected with my friends. Margaret and Helen became my constant companions. We had long lunches, went to the theater, and took a cruise to Alaska, something I had always wanted to do but Robert had dismissed as for old people. I discovered at 78 that I was not old, I was experienced. I started a container garden on my terrace. I filled pots with soil and planted herbs, tomatoes, and of course roses. Miniature, resilient little bushes that bloomed with a fierce, joyful tenacity. Tending to them, my hands in the dirt, I felt a sense of ownership and creation that I realized I had not truly felt in a decade. Arthur would give me occasional, brief updates, which I never asked for but which he seemed to think I deserved to hear. Robert had been forced to move into a small, rented apartment, living off his meager pension. David's financial situation, without my constant infusions of cash, had completely collapsed, and he'd had to take a dreary sales job. Chloe, unable to afford her prestigious university, had transferred to a local community college and was working part-time in a coffee shop. The Vance family, without the grand Thorne house as their stage, seemed to have shrunk back into obscurity. I felt no glee at their downfall. Glee would imply they still occupied a space in my emotional landscape. They didn't. I felt a distant, detached sadness, the kind one feels when reading about a preventable tragedy in the newspaper. They had been given a gift, a life of comfort, a person who cared for them, and they had destroyed it with their own greed and cruelty. They were the authors of their own miserable story. I was busy writing a new one for myself. One sunny afternoon, I was sitting on my terrace reading a book, a glass of iced tea at my elbow. A gentle sea breeze rustled the pages. My little rose bushes were in full bloom. The peace I felt was so profound, so complete that it was almost a physical presence. I was not a stepmother, I was not a widow, I was not a bank, I was Beatrice. And Beatrice was finally home. A closing monologue. For 10 years, I believed that family was something you could build with patience and generosity, that love could fill the spaces between people who weren't connected by blood. I learned in the most painful way possible that this is only true when it's met with respect. Respect is the foundation. Without it, everything will eventually crumble. My mistake was in thinking that my worth was something I had to prove to them. I spent a decade auditioning for a role I already deserved simply by being a person. The greatest lesson I learned is that your dignity is not something another person can give to you. It is only something you can choose to give away. The moment I stopped letting them define my place in the world was the moment I reclaimed my own. It is never too late to demand respect, starting with respecting yourself enough to walk away from anyone who diminishes you. You are the architect of your own life. Build it on solid ground. And that's my story. Thank you for listening.